It's good to be here with you this day. We continue in our series dealing with marriage, and today we're going to be talking about becoming one in terms of communication and what that means for us as Christians as we try to develop a relationship with one another and with our spouses. Basically, what we're looking at is this idea of understanding each other. And this concept comes from 1 Peter 3, verse 7. And let's read this together in respect for the Word of God. Let's stand. 1 Peter 3, 7. Husbands, likewise, dwell with them with understanding, giving honor to the wife as to the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers may not be hindered. The Lord add His blessing to the reading of His Word. You may be seated. For a number of years, I taught at Grace University in Omaha, Nebraska. We actually have some graduates of Grace that attend here, Tony and Sue Ann Harmon. Some of you know it, but you may not know two guests that we have today that are also graduates of Grace University. It used to be Grace College of the Bible. Chuck and Lydia Cheddar. Y'all stand up. Chuck and... Yeah, we're going to make you do it, Chuck. You don't... Okay, you can sit down. Way to go. Chuck was my pastor in Omaha, Nebraska. He's the pastor of a community Bible church, and I attended that church for about 9 years when I wasn't preaching somewhere else. Sometimes I'd walk in and Chuck would look at me and say, "Now, who are you?" Anyway, his dad also taught at Grace University. One of my favorite things at Grace was teaching the students, and oftentimes one of the techniques I would use is I'd get them involved in an argument. You know, and they'd take a side and they'd start proving their point, and I would take the other side just to be me. And I'd argue with them, even though I may disagree with the side that I took. There's this one gal in particular, named Anita. Anita was bright gal. And one time she had the truth, she had the answer, and she was letting me have it. And so I took the opposite side, and I backed her into a corner, and she capitulated. She changed her mind. And when we got done, I looked at Anita and said, "Anita, don't ever back down from the truth." Anita went on and did an internship at Focus on the Family. She wrote an article for them on this issue of communication. And it's entitled "The University of Matrimony" by Anita Morell. Let me read you some of this article, if I may. It's very enlightening on this concept of communication, especially in marriage. Everyone tells you that communication is key. But before I was actually married, whether nodding at my pastor in premarital counseling or trying to escape a pesky relative, I agreed, but didn't really think too much about it. After all, Chris and I have had those 4-hour late-night conversations we could talk about easily with everything. We laughed and we agreed on welfare reform and other political issues. That should cover it, I thought. But once we'd been married about 6 weeks, I was in trouble. It all came to head one night when we disagreed over whether or not we should be watching television. We both felt frustrated. After a less than intimate time of cold silence, one of us finally said, "What's really the deal here?" We felt like we'd lost our emotional bond. What happened? A good friend of ours looked back on his extensive 2 years of marital experience and gave me some insight. He explained that people don't always hear the words we say. They read into them and perceive their own message. This confused me a little since I'm a very straightforward person, and she is, and always meant exactly what I say, and I assume others do too. No, he said, you have to understand the whole message with tone and body and language and timing and circumstances. This sounded faintly familiar. Sure enough, in our Getting Ready for Marriage workbook, we had read that most communication is from nonverbal clues. like eye contact, shrugs, or facial expressions. After that, I started paying more attention to how I said things rather than what I said. Suddenly, I began to see things from Chris's point of view and started to make little, seemingly insignificant changes. I listened to my tone of voice. I worked to lean forward and maintain eye contact whenever he was talking and ask him follow-up questions. And I learned to pay attention to his nonverbal cues in case I needed to explain further or rephrase something. I also asked him when he would like me to talk to him and incorporated those as well. Sometimes we just ignored each other's tone or terrible timing. And we often took long walks when we had a bigger or unpleasant issue to discuss. That way our home remained a place of love and refuge. And we stayed much more calm and objective if there were other people around. It turned out that a fight that started over how much television to watch was actually about whether each of our emotional needs were being met. While it wasn't a fun experience, it was a necessary one. We learned that disagreements are not always to be taken at face value, and that sometimes are better than other times to hash things out. We were reminded that it is extremely important to communicate that we love each other. But most important, we learned that real communication is more than mere words. You know, communication is something that we all struggle with. And the message that I have today is for couples, yes. But, you know, it applies to everyone, whether you're married or not. And I have some principles from Scripture and some observations from psychology, if you will, to help us in terms of how we can better communicate with our mates and with people in general. Communication is a lifelong process. And one of the biggest communication factors that we deal with is communication in marriage, and marriage is between a man and a woman. And so one of the things we first have to do in terms of communication is understand that men and women are different in terms of how they think and how they communicate. So here are some general observations. Are they absolutely correct? No, they're not biblical. They're more from a psychological perspective, but they're generally true, at least many people think them to be. And so if they're not true in your life, you can ignore it, okay? But here are some differences that I've noticed and other people have noticed about the difference between men and women and what they value and how they communicate. First, men. Men tend to be objective thinkers, and women tend to be subjective thinkers. Men think in terms of concepts, you know, and they have a detached point of view, and they evaluate from a distance. But a woman, she deals with the subjective. It's the emotions and feelings things. And therefore, she's involved in what's going on. Guys, this is why if you disagree with your wife on an issue, you're in some ways attacking her emotions and her feelings. And that's why they get upset when you disagree with them, because they're thinking subjectively, you're thinking objectively, and, well, you make them mad. Additionally, men tend to be essential in nature, and women detailed in nature. You go evaluate a house, whether you want to buy it or not. The guy says, it's close to work. The yard is low maintenance. And the wife says, wow, isn't this a great place to hang curtains? And boy, wouldn't flowers look good? And on top of that, guys, we have to understand that. It's why your wives get upset when we don't notice their haircuts. You know, the guy, the essential, he walks in, there's his wife. She still loves him. She has dinner on the table. Everything is all right. And the wife has just cut her hair, and he doesn't notice. It's the details. And so they want us to notice the details. Additionally, men tend to think in logic, and women tend to think in emotion, feelings again. Men tend to think by a step-by-step process. Women, intuitive. It just doesn't feel right. And it drives guys crazy. But well, the intuitive is developed through the nuances of life and communication. And women tend to be more sensitive to the subtle signals that people give off. Additionally, when men communicate, they like to go straight to the point. Here's the issue, let's tackle it. Head on. That's not the way women do it. They circle an issue and circle an issue. They're like a buzzard. And when they're finally sure it's dead, they pounce on it. I mean, and this drives men crazy. What's the point? I have to admit that there's times I take my wife by the shoulder and I say, I love you dearly, but what's the point? You know, well, for them it's the telling of the story. But for the guy, they just want to know the essentials. Again, they want to get straight to it. Men, they tend to center their being and thought around their work. Their personality is tied up in what they do. And therefore, if you criticize what they do, you're criticizing them. Women, it's the home and family. And so if you criticize the home, the family, you're attacking them. And so if you don't like what they cook, you're attacking them. The man says it's just the food. No, the food is an extension of her. So if you don't like it, eat it and don't say anything, okay? Never happened at my house. My wife always cooks good stuff. So anyway. Additionally, men, again, tend to communicate in terms of facts and ideas. It's the abstract concept of things. How was work today? Fine. Did anything happen? No. Women communicate in the feelings and emotions again. And what the wife wants to hear is this. How were things at work today? Oh, Jim spilt coffee on Mary's lap, and Mary got mad, so she whopped Jim upside the head with a... And she wants to hear the story, the feelings, stuff. And the guy says, nothing happened at work. At least to talk about. I mean, it's the way it is. Additionally, men tend to fight discouragement. And the thing that they struggle most with is depression. Depression and discouragement. And that's why, wives, your responsibility needs to be in communicating with your husband encouragement and love and support. Women, on the other hand, they struggle with loneliness, or could I change that word, relationship. They want to know the relationship is secure, and they need constant reassurance that they're not alone. You see this especially with young mothers who are stay-at-home moms, and they raise their kids, and all day long they talk in kids' language. Do you have a boo-boo? And when daddy gets home, she doesn't want to talk about boo-boo. She wants adult conversation. She wants relationship. Men, the thing they strive for is respect. They want people to look up to them, their wife, their children, and people around them. Wives, women, they want to know that they're important, that they're a priority of your life. And so the husbands need to give their wives the priority that they deserve and need. And wives need to show their husbands the respect and not nag him all the time. Now let me talk about one other thing. It's physiological in nature and not psychological. And that is the center of gravity of men and women. Do you understand that a man's center of gravity is 3 inches higher than that of a woman? You say, so what? Well, here's the thing. Because a man's center of gravity is 3 inches higher, when he's sitting down and raises an arm, it changes the focal point, and therefore he's got to get more comfortable, in his chair. A woman, because her center of gravity is 3 inches lower, She can flail her arms like a goose, and it doesn't change anything, and she's comfortable. That's why men are accused of being so antsy. It has nothing to do with psychology, it's physiological. That's why men are said to be so nervous and moving all the time. Now, in conclusion, what do I understand about men and women? They're different. They think different. They communicate different. And it's our responsibility to communicate in terms that the other understands. And men, it is our responsibility. The command in 1 Peter 3:7 is this: men, husbands, dwell with your wives according to understanding. Whose responsibility is it to understand our wives? It's ours. Whose responsibility is it to communicate in terms that they can understand? It's ours. And you respond to me, who can understand a woman? And the correct response is, another woman. But that's not what God said. He's given us the responsibility to understand our wives. By the way, wives, that does not mean you can abdicate any sense of trying to communicate in their language, a guy's language. It's both responsibilities. But there are barriers to effective communication that we've got to watch out for. Here are a few that I see from a biblical standpoint. One is fear of rejection. The reason we don't share is we're afraid what people will think of us. Our mate, if they only knew what I was thinking, if they only knew what I was doing, they'd hate me, they'd reject me. And we're uncertain of the response or the acceptance. Do you remember when Adam and Eve sinned in the garden? What's the first thing they did? They hid. Why did they hide? They weren't sure what God would do. And you see, that's what happens with us. We don't share because we don't know what the response will be. We don't have the confidence. And as a result, we don't share. We clam up. That leads to the second thing. Passivity. There's other terms we use for passivity. One is the silent treatment. Now, you know what Proverbs says about talking. You know, it says, even a fool who keeps his mouth shut is deemed wise. Or, as we say in common vernacular, it better be thought a fool than open your mouth and remove all doubt. Yeah, there's a time to keep your mouth shut. But do you understand that passivity in communication is really shutting the other person off? It's punishment. The greatest punishment a person can give to another person is not to talk to them. It's isolating yourself from them. And as a result of that, it's a terrible way to try and develop communication. You can't communicate if you don't talk, if you don't relate. So passivity will hinder communication. Then pride. Pride comes in various forms, and you know what Proverbs says. Pride comes before a fall, and a haughty spirit before destruction. But pride takes different forms. One, pride can take the form of, I know what's right. And therefore, when you start talking, up, jump in, stop it right there. I got the answer, already know it. You don't even have to finish talking or explaining. I am the all-encompassing one. I've got the answer. That's pride, that's arrogance. The opposite side is when someone starts talking because you know all the answers, you criticize and judge them immediately. Oh, that's a terrible idea. Rather than developing understanding, what pride does is it shuts up the other person and throws them into passivity. It's also reflected in criticism. In Colossians 3:12 and following, it says, put on tender mercies, kindness, humility, meekness, long-suffering, bearing with one another and forgiving one another. If anyone has a complaint against another, even as Christ forgave you, so you also do also. But above all things, put on love, which is the bond of perfection. You know, criticism is when another person talks, you're attacking. And when you attack, there's a vicious circle in communication. I attack you, you become defensive, and you attack me. And what does it do to communication? It shuts down communication and starts a good fight. Well, it may not be a good fight. It could be a bad one. Parents are really bad at this one. Kids start to explain themselves, and immediately we jump in and whop them. We criticize them before we even hear the explanation. Criticism, all these things are barriers to effective communication. But what is communication? There are different levels of communication, and this is psychological. Again, this isn't biblical. And so you can disagree with this if you wish to, and I'd have no basis on which to say anything other than many people believe that there are 5 levels of communication. The first level is the level of I can't even say it. Cliche conversation. You know what cliche conversation is? How you doing today? I'm as fine as frog's hair. Now, if you're from the South, you understand frogs don't have hair. So it means what? It's a cliche. It means nothing. You're just passing time. Inside, you're hurting, you're breaking, your heart is weeping for the pain that and all you say is, fine. You've seen this when you've asked a person how you're doing, and they say, oh, I'm doing horrible. You know, I mean, and they say, oh, okay, great, and boom, they're gone. They don't want depth. They just want acknowledge that you're there and move on. That's cliche conversation. The second level of communication is the reporting of facts. Oh, what's happening? Oh, Arizona won last night. Beat USC. That's a fact, okay? Oh, the temperature today is going to be 83 degrees. What's it going to be in Omaha today? About 42. That's a fact. There's no risk involved in facts. It's just a dealing with circumstances. There's no personal opinion. There's no risk. Now, the interesting thing is 90% of the people in America never get beyond level 2 in their conversation. Most couples don't get beyond level 2. Level 3 conversation is the idea of judgments. It's the passing down of personal ideas and values. It's the way of expressing yourself in which risk is involved, because if I express an opinion, what could happen? You could have a different opinion. When I was in the military, I was sent to Great Lakes Naval Training Center to teach me how to be a teacher. And I spent a month in Chicago one week. Temperature never got above 20 degrees. It snowed every day. The second day I was in Chicago, I had to make a presentation in the class, and I did. And the chief instructor was watching my presentation. He came up to me and says, Captain, you don't need this course. It's a waste of the government's money in your time and my time for you to be here. I know you're scheduled to be here for a month, but you can go home. And I went, yes! Because I was praying that. Because there was a conference back in Washington, D.C. that I wanted to attend. And I couldn't because I was in Chicago. He said, come to my office. So I went into his office and we talked. And he said, but before you leave and whatnot, I'd like you to give us some input. What have you noticed about us? Some criticism, some constructive criticism. And so I said, well, okay, there was a couple of things I noticed. And I started sharing. And just as I started sharing, in walked the executive officer of the unit. And he heard me criticizing, and boy, did he shut me up in a hurry. He lit into me like stink on a skunk. And I tell you, I was sitting there, and I literally did this. I took out my handkerchief and went. And the chief instructor looked at the XO and said, "Sir, you're walking in the middle of a conversation. Please back up." And I said, "I'm gone." And I went back to class, and the chief instructor explained to the XO. And he came and got me, and he apologized. But when you hear criticisms and judgments, you run the risk of being attacked in response. That's what ideas and judgments are about. The fourth level, the level of feelings and emotions. Hey guys, have you been awake this far? Are you catching anything that I'm saying? Where do women live? Huh? Feelings and emotions. And where do we live? Guys, level 2. Facts, figures. Our wives are wanting feelings and emotions, the depth of communication, and all we want to give are the facts and figures. Level 4 is the sharing of, I feel this way. Hey, listen, you can argue about emotions and feelings, but you can't argue that they have that emotion and feeling. You can argue about the validity of it, but you can't argue. Women crave this, and men are so non-prone to give it. The fifth level of communication is this. It's open communication, the sharing of dreams and your innermost thoughts. It's the willingness to be totally and open and vulnerable. Now, I understand you shouldn't be open and vulnerable to every single person. And there's some ideas and dreams that you have that only a select few should hear. But by and large, most people never live in this realm of open communication of feelings and dreams and thoughts. And yet that's where we ought to be. As a congregation, as an individual, and as a married couple. There should be this openness and the ability to talk about anything. Yes, there's right and wrong times. Yes, there's right and wrong things to talk about when. But there needs to be this freedom. Yes, it involves risk. Yes, it is scary. Well, what does that mean for us today? What is it that we can do? How's my life going to be different as a result of this? Well, let me first say this about communication between men and women. I'm going to debunk the myth of the mystique of women. You know what the mystique of women is? They think different than guys. That's all it is. And if you understand that they think different, then it's not a mystery. It's something that's easily solvable. All we have to do is think like they think. And I know we'll never be able to do it, but there's a process that we can go through. And ladies, this applies to you as well. Even though the man is the one in 1 Peter 3:7 who's commanded to understand the wife, I think it is equally accountable and responsible for the wife to understand the husband. And there is a meeting together in the middle somewhere in terms of communication. The process involves simply this. Step 1, recognize there's a difference between your communication processes. And try and get beyond levels 1 and 2, the cliches and the facts. Step 2 is always communicate love in your relationship. When you're talking, always reassure each other that love is the central thing, that you care for the other person more than you care for yourself. Third, Avoid shutting down communication by criticism and premature judgment. By jumping in and finishing statements for them. Allow them to speak, which leads to the fourth thing. Listen. One of the biggest things in the process of communication is listen. We don't listen. We're too busy formulating our own answers as opposed to understanding what the other person says. In James 1 it says, be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. Or in other words, God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth, and we should follow the ratios in communication. Listen twice as much as we speak. And finally, we need to understand it's grace that connects men and women. And without the grace of God and the power of the Spirit, I don't know how any of us can do it. The solution for better communication is the supernatural assistance of the Holy Spirit, who created both men and women and understands us totally and enables us to be able to understand and communicate. So guys, what does that mean? Don't get discouraged when you don't understand women. You're not alone. Instead, keep up the effort. Try to share your feelings, your emotions, your dreams with this one that God has entrusted you with. And let them see your heart and not just your hands, what you do. Let them see what's going on in your minds. I know it's hard because guys don't like to be vulnerable. We don't like to be open. But it's our responsibility. And wives, understand that there are communication barriers. Sometimes, rather than telling the story, just get to the facts. Just get to the facts, cut straight to the chase, and the men might even listen better because they have much shorter attention spans. And so as a result, maybe shorten the story a little bit, get more to the point. It reminds me of something that happened just recently. I was talking with a man from our church, and his wife saw him talking to his mother. And he talked to her in terms that she felt were offensive. And when he was done, she went to him and said, "You need to apologize to your mother." He says, "What for?" He says, "You were very direct and abrupt with her." And he looked at her and says, "Well, she grew up with 4 brothers. She had 3 sons. She doesn't know how to talk girl. I was just talking to her in guy language." And mother was not offended in the least. It was just he was communicating to her like a guy, and she was expecting him to communicate to his mother like a girl. Understand there's differences. God loves us all. He made us different. He spoke to us and communicated in good terms. It's understandable. Let's do the same thing with our mates and with one another. Striving to communicate in terms that the other person can understand, and not just facts, but the deeper levels of communication. Would you join me in prayer?